That's fine. We'll just talk over each other. All right, I'll go ahead and get started here. How's it going? I appreciate everyone hanging out at this presentation. It's not going to be the most exciting one, so I appreciate your perseverance. So, let's see. Hold on. There we go. My name is Damon Danchenko. I'm a web architect at the U.S. Department of Justice. And this is a screenshot of the main website we're working on, justice.gov. We manage a bunch of other websites, FOIA.gov for the Freedom of Information Act, stopfraud.gov. We manage the infrastructure of DEA.gov, U.S. Marshals, a bunch of other external websites, and our intranet as well. But this is the site that we spend most of our time on, and this is the most visible site that we were working on. So today I'm going to talk briefly about us migrating justice.gov into Drupal, but there's actually someone else who's speaking about that in more detail. I'm going to focus on setting up a Drupal development environment within an agency, which is not that easy. So there are a couple aspects to it. There's a security aspect, basically getting yourself approved to use a development environment for Drupal purposes, especially if you're hosted in the cloud. So that's one part of it. And the other part is simply the software configuration. And there's networking involved, a great deal of networking involved, depending on your infrastructure, and that ties into both the software part of it and the security part of it. So the big thing is justice.gov is migrating to Drupal. And we're super excited about it. We're nearly done. We've been working on this for about a year and a half now, and maybe actually closer to 2+ years if you consider the planning that's involved. It's a major undertaking, and so we're very excited about it. We're actually nearly done. We expect to be finished with our last set of migrations the end of September, and we're very much looking forward to that. We've been taking an agile approach to migration, so we started off making about one major release a month. That was the plan. So a release would include maybe 2 or 3 large sections of our website. And it sort of evolved a bit to several smaller migrations a month. So I think we're releasing about once a week a small part of the site, or sometimes just a new code base. And that's been working really well for us. So just to get into what we're migrating from. So previously we had just static HTML. That was justice.gov, just simply HTML files. Maybe some reusable headers here and there, some SSI files, but pretty much static HTML and binary content. We had some PHP, some database-driven stuff. We had a WordPress application to handle the blogs part of our site, but this is what made it difficult, just going from flat HTML and migrating into Drupal. So for all of our sites, including Justice, we have an operations and maintenance team. So I'll get into that in a little bit. But so the point is, we have an existing team that handles day-to-day site updates, configurations, what have you. And we didn't have the resources to try to take on a massive Drupal migration like this ourselves. So we contracted out to a third-party vendor for taking care of the migration for us. So when we started this project about a year and a half ago, even before that, we always knew we had to consider transition. So we have an expert migration team that is taking care of the migrations for us, and they're doing a great job. But at some point, that project's going to end. It's going to end actually the end of this fiscal year. So we need to be in a good position to take that on. So that's not only the skill set. I mean, like I said, most of our O&M developers are kind of front end, a little bit of back end PHP, but not really Drupal experts. Luckily, we had an opening in our O&M team that's been vacant for several months, and we made sure that we brought on a Drupal expert, and we actually got him on very recently, and we're very excited about that. He's doing a great job, and we feel much more comfortable about that. So, some of our O&M team, actually everyone has taken Drupal training and have caught up quite a bit, but it's nice to know that we have a Drupal guru on our team who's able to help us take over. So we've been planning this since the very beginning, but we're officially going into transition starting in August. Actually, just a couple weeks, or is that next week already? Soon. So we're getting there, and we have we have a lot to do, but we've already started taking over some of the sprints, some of the sprint planning. Our developers are taking on tickets. So they're really coming along, and we'll be set for transition. So not only is there a skill set involved, there's also the environment. So right now we have what we call DevNet, and that's a group of workstations that our developers use for website development, and it's on an isolated network that we call our DevNet network. So, throughout the department everyone gets these kind of standard workstations that are for desktop publishing, checking email, very simple, and they're very locked down though. They have security controls associated with them. It's very limited in terms of how you can configure your workstation. It's very limited in terms of what you can install. So, for instance, you can use one browser and that's it. So obviously, if you're trying to test a site in multiple browsers, that's not really going to work. You can't change your Etsy host file if you want to, point to a VM or something. So we couldn't use our standard general DOJ workstations. We have these DevNet ones. So we can install tools specific to web development. They're less locked down, so they're not under the purview of our security department. At least that was the case. And the caveat was, okay, you can kind of have and maintain your own network that's not going to touch anything else. Fine, you can do whatever you want with it, but it needs to be isolated. So that's what we've been working with, and that's been fine so far. But now we're entering, Drupal development, and more importantly, we're dealing with cloud-based hosting. So now all of a sudden, our DevNet machines need to update parts of a site that are not hosted within our data center. So all of our other sites are hosted in our data center confined within our TIC, and our development workstations were isolated, and we had ways of getting content from our workstations to our site development environment. But the point is, none of our workstations connected to production systems. They were logistically isolated, so we didn't need an authority to operate just that subnet, which worked out fine for us. But now we have some new connections needed. We needed to connect to a code repository. We needed to connect to our web servers that are cloud-based. And we also have a content delivery network for justice.gov, and we need to connect to those host servers to update, the apology pages or to check logs, what have you. So the point is that we needed to reach outside of our network from these machines. So that entailed a security review. So specifically, these are the things that we needed. We needed HTTPS access to our code repository, and you could do that with SSH port 22 should be fine and probably preferred, but recommendations from our network ops folks were if you can use HTTPS, that would be great, because that goes through our proxy server, and that is scanned. That scans all traffic, so that would be a preferred route. We also needed SSH access to specific web servers, to our hosting web servers, and to our content delivery network. And those we didn't have actually a logical route from our DevNet machines through port 22 to the outside world. We needed to go through destination NATs. So that's another part of our request. And the other major part is user agent strings. So our proxy servers limit very specific user agents. I don't know what that full list is. I would never have access to it, but it would take into account your web browser, for instance. So it would allow connections for one particular web browser with one particular user agent string, and anything else it'll simply block. So there are some things that throughout Drupal development that use user agents that are not web browser user agent. So after the security review, what are the results? Well, this involved a full-blown CNA. So luckily we didn't need, and I'll be throwing out some security lingo throughout this. So I'll try to explain what's involved the best I can. So a certification and accreditation is kind of a major undertaking. The good thing is that it made sense for us to roll up our DevNet environment into an existing CNA. So just the way things were connected, it made sense to do that from a security standpoint, from a networking standpoint as well. That made things a lot easier for us. So all we needed, and actually for that umbrella system, it has an ATO that's coming up in August, actually. So ATOs last 3 years at least for this particular system. It happens to be coming up now. So that was actually good timing. So we what made sense to our security folks was to come up with an ATT, an authority to test. It's a shorter duration authority, and it gives you time to sort of test out an environment before it's really production ready. So, and then the idea was that would last until the recertification of our umbrella system, our parent system, and then our DevNet environment would roll up under that CNA. So that's how we approached it. Now, in order to get an authority to test, there were some caveats. So we could not now be, isolated where security folks weren't reviewing our systems. They had to now. So we had to pull them under our security controls and monitoring software that we use. So these are things that'll, make sure that you're automatically logged out after a certain amount of time. There's specific firewall configurations. Passwords, if you are using passwords, if you're not using PIV cards, certain length and they time out, all these sorts of things. But also they make sure that whatever your software you're using is approved, first of all, and that any software you have is up to date and you don't have any critical vulnerabilities. So this is really, a significant undertaking for us. And it's something that should be considered well in advance before taking on something like this. Don't take it for granted. It's going to eat up a lot of your time. So, obviously that if it's not planned ahead of time, it can be a significant risk to your transition schedule. So I think we started this process in January and we've just finished it a month or so ago. So it can take some time. So instead of saving it for the end, I'll just give our security takeaway now. Start early. As I said, it takes a lot of time. Try to have this a bit out of order. Try to plan all your connections ahead of time, and that's difficult. I think that was difficult for us because our operations and maintenance team, we didn't know all the intricacies. We didn't know the list of user agent strings that would be used by the various software that you use. So, Drush, for instance, or just the way Drupal connects outside, they have their own set of user agent strings. What sort of network connections do you need? What ports do you need opened? What IPs do they need to connect to? What fully qualified domain names do they need to connect to? All of that needs to be planned as much as possible ahead of time. And then really sit down with your policy analyst and review all these things. Make sure he or she is clear on what sort of connections are needed, what does that imply, what ports, just have a regular open dialogue with your security policy analyst to make sure nothing kind of pops up last minute. And as you discover something, just make sure you share that. So now I'll talk a bit about our software configuration and network configuration as well. So I tried to kind of squeeze in here some of the tools that we're using, some of the approaches that we're using, and this might be just specific to the way that we've handled it. So there's certainly other ways to go about it. But first, I'll start off with virtual machines. So the one thing that was kind of stressed to us at the beginning is whatever we're testing on locally, we want it to match our production server environment as much as possible. So yes, even though you can install and set up Drupal on whatever OS you happen to be having in your government workstations, ideally you'll want to have an OS that really identical, ideally, to your production OSs. So in our situation, we choose to go the route of virtual machines. Ideally, ones that are automated, that you can provision quickly and easily and automatically. That way, you can create a VM and share it with developers. You can destroy it if you see it has problems and create a brand new one. So that's our approach. And the other part of it that was quite difficult for us was syncing between the host OS and the guest OS. And that really took a lot of time for us. So there were a couple of approaches. We tried mounting directories. We tried SMB. We tried native mounting tools. And we ended up going with an rsync. And specifically, I think, I don't know the details, but I think there's a Vagrant plugin for rsyncing, and that seems to have worked extremely well for us. It's very fast, and that's some of the issues we found with some of the shared drives setup, is that it tended to be very slow. So for the Vagrant rsync we're using, it's triggered. The rsync is triggered by every update you make. So you don't have to wait for a cron task or something like that. As soon as you make an update, it's on your VM, and that's perfect. And then that's one way, though, and I think there's another Vagrant command or plugin to rsync the other way, and that's for things like making features. So anytime Drupal makes an update to a file, you'll want to get that back into your host OS. So we actually resolved this issue very recently, and I'm pretty psyched about how it's working out. So the other part is you'll need some sort of code repository. We have an external code repository. Some agencies would rather have them internally. So that's something to consider. Network routes is a major part of that. Drush obviously is important. Again, network routes, but also actually for a lot of this, a big part of it was configuring your software to use a proxy server to get out via HTTP or HTTPS, and that also took a considerable amount of time. Every single software has their own config file or some way of configuring the software to use a proxy server and over which port. And that typically whenever we'd have some sort of connection failure, that was usually the cause. And it involved, sometimes the documentation for that is not readily available, so you have to really hunt around for it. Some sort of CSS framework. I mean, we use Sass, but that's actually we use Sass and Zombie as well. I'll get into that. So the one thing we didn't have to worry about were our IDEs, and that was nice. That was a relief. There was absolutely no configuration. We didn't have each of our developers, whether it's using Eclipse or Sublime, everyone has their own preference for an IDE. And this is one thing where we can say, use whatever you want. You didn't need to integrate it in any way. But of course, it had to be in our kind of approved software list, and it had to be up to date. It couldn't have any security vulnerabilities because that would get flagged in our reporting. But that was nice that we didn't have to tell our developers to use a particular IDE. Automated code testing. So we have some externally hosted code testing and internally as well. And this is actually something that we're still a tiny bit hung up on. So I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's some issues getting Zombie to work with our virtual machines. Any of the kind of front end JavaScript based automated testing, we're still having some issues in our local environment. We're working through those. And some sort of ticketing system. We have our ticketing system integrated with our code repository, with our automated testing. So that's been very helpful. It's easy to track tickets that way. Let's see. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Yeah. Can always come back. Okay. So that's our setup. So now, how can we optimize? I just kind of went through how we set up our environment, but it works, which we're very excited about. Actually, we started setting up an environment, several months ago before we started our security review. So we started sometime last year, and we hit a lot of roadblocks. So a lot of them had to do with, as I mentioned, user agent strings, proxy servers, and just network connectivity. And actually, I didn't mention it earlier, but it's not really for Drupal development, but some sort of packet capturing software would be very helpful, actually. So you can see when you're running a drush command, and you see where it gets hung up. You can see what user agent it's passing, and you can check with your security folks to see if that's on the whitelist or not. That's been very helpful as well. But anyway, we came up with a solution that works for us, but by no means is it ideal. So as we're going through this, we came across some other ideas, some other things to consider, some potential solutions that we evaluated. So one was, and this came from our security folks, why not use a cloud-hosted development environment? And that makes sense, and that's actually a government initiative to use cloud-based computing if it makes sense wherever possible, and that actually may be something we will consider down the road. One is we simply didn't have time to provision something like that, and also one of our migration team developers mentioned that he's had experience working on another project, and it turned out to be a bit slow. Just the lag was too awkward to deal with. I don't know if that's still the case or that was just his particular experience, but that might be something to consider, and that might be something we might consider down the road. Another option was just set up a separate DSL line or some other isolated network that's outside of your TIC. That way you don't have to worry, you don't have to involve your security team in the sense that your security team doesn't have to worry about how these connections are affecting other networks within your TIC. So I've heard of other government agencies using this approach, and it makes sense. Just keep things isolated and just reach out to your cloud-based infrastructure, and that should be good. And what I've heard from that is it works well, and it's just something that we again didn't have time to set up, but it might be something we considered. And actually, during our development, when we're getting very frustrated with all the ports that we needed to open through our TIC, we were like, we had a hotspot just sitting right there that we use for testing. Can we not just go through that thing? That would be so much easier, and it would have been. It would have saved us some hassle. But of course, that's not a real production ready sort of setup. It's not long term. It's not ideal, but it was definitely something we considered. Let's see. So virtual machines versus whatever OS you're using. So our web servers are Ubuntu based, and I like using Ubuntu as just a workstation OS, and at least one of our other developers do. So why not just wipe out whatever OS we have and just install that, and then our workstations are set up exactly like our servers. That would just be so much easier. And in some cases it would have been. I think, and we might actually still do that. We have some spare workstations, and we might test that out. But the idea was, we want to keep all of our DevNet workstation under the same OS, same software version. For our security controls, it'll just be much easier if everything was the same. So we were hesitant to, and some of our developers are more front-end developers and wouldn't feel comfortable in an Ubuntu environment. That would be a huge change. So we would have some on one OS, some on another, and that wouldn't necessarily work out well. Then there's simply the mix of software. The mix of software we're using is pretty much handed down to us from our migration team. They found that works well, and we're trying to use the same mix. And we've considered other software mixes, but I'm sure maybe some of you out there have seen what I've listed and said, thought, why don't you try some different approach? And actually, that's what I'd like to hear about. If anyone has set up an environment, that it'd be great to hear what approach you took. So that's the end of my presentation. Really, I'm going to save some time for any Q&A, but also if anyone has set up or been involved with setting up a Drupal development environment in your own agencies, we'd love to hear about approaches or ideas that we can use or anyone else in the audience can use. So yeah, question?
Yeah, you mentioned the ticketing system integration.
Yeah.
And a ticketing system is what system did you use?
Oh, sure. So the question is, I talked a bit about our ticketing system, and what ticketing system did we use? So we use JIRA, and that integrates well with some of the automated testing we're using and with our code repository. So whenever someone makes a commit, that can be tied to the ticket itself. The ticket can be tied to the commit. So it just makes keeping track of tickets and code easier.
In elaboration, did you make any changes to the just the name and staff?
I wasn't really. So the question was, our ticketing system. Did we need to make any configuration changes to it, or was it a native install? So it's externally hosted. I don't think so. As far as I understand, we haven't set it up. It was the migration team that set it up. And actually, part of this transition period is we're going to be taking over a lot of these accounts and migrating the account. In some cases, we have to make new accounts. So for JIRA, we have to make a new account and then migrate the back end into our new account. That's the easier way to set up billing for it, really. So as far as I know, it's a suite, and we just use what's in that suite.
Okay, just on that same system.
Sure.
So there's configuration requests, then there's also content requests, and like I love the ATF. I don't know the
Okay.
Do you use it for all your ticketing?
No.
JIRA? So then
No.
Is that hard? Because our guys do a lot of
it is hard. I'm glad you asked that. So the question was, we use JIRA for our Drupal development and migrations, but we obviously have other sites that we work on, and we have another ticketing system for that. We use Remedy. So internally we use Remedy, and so what'll typically happen is if we have a request from some component of DOJ, whether it be antitrust division, tax division, whatever, they need to make an update to either a site that they manage or a part of justice.gov. Since we use Remedy department-wide, a request will typically come in through that, and then it'll be assigned to our group, and then we have to figure out, well, do we make a JIRA ticket for it or don't bother? And this is something that we're still working through. So our approach is if it's related to the Drupal migration, and if it's something that would be added to our backlog, then we want to make sure it's included in JIRA. If it's some minor change that won't involve a code change, there's just simply a content change, and we don't really need to track it per se, that's something we'll just keep in our in-house ticketing system and track that way. Any other questions or suggestions? Yeah, right there.
How did you handle? You talked about virtual machines. You use Vagrant. I'm assuming you use Vagrant virtual blocks on the local workstation.
That's right. Yeah.
How did you handle the requirement to not give administrator access to users to start up new Vagrant or virtual blocks instantly? You have to give them administrator access.
So the question is, we use Vagrant and VirtualBox for our VMs on our DevNet machines, and the question is, to spin up a VM, you need admin permissions, and how did we provision those given security controls? So we have we've rolled in our DevNet environment into our security monitoring platform, and it monitors things like policies. So, who has admin rights and whatnot. So for some of these controls, we're not strictly inheriting all of them. We can't. So one, for instance, is removable media. We're required, as part of our operations, we require the ability to use thumb drives. And yes, they have to be scanned, but that's something that a strict policy would say you can't insert a thumb drive into your DOJ machine. So it's a bit of a hybrid in the sense that we're isolated, and these are some things that are that we won't be able to. One is approved browsers. We're using multiple browsers. So to answer your question, these users do have admin privileges to install virtual machines, to change your Etsy post file, for instance, that would normally involve administrative rights. So these are things that you wouldn't be able to do on a network throughout your agency. It would really have to be an isolated network. Yeah. Any other question?
Yeah. I'm intrigued by the idea of the cloud-hosted development environment. Could you expand on that a little bit more? Do you wish you got in that? Would it have been
So the question was, what about a cloud-hosted development environment? So, just having thin clients in your office and just doing all your actual computing, your development on some cloud-hosted servers. So we definitely consider that, and we still may consider that. I haven't had experience with it, so I can't say firsthand. Sorry? It's slow. Yeah. Okay. So, and that's what I heard. So, some people were saying that it's slow, and that's I don't know if that's changed. I don't know if that's specific to a certain environment, but from what I hear, it's just not conducive to an efficient workflow. Sure.
Sorry, I'm kind of getting down to the nitty-gritty, but also you said you have hosted JIRA stuff. Where did you post that at? Did you have to, since that's a cloud service, did you have to go through the FedRAMP process to be able to use that?
Right. So the question was about JIRA. Where do we have it hosted, and did we have to go through FedRAMP for that? So there are a couple parts to it. So we have a CNA for what we call just basically, we have a CNA for justice.gov that used to be rolled into another CNA that encompassed all our internally hosted sites. But now it's significantly different, so we kind of had to move it over to its own CNA. And part of that includes our SLA with our hosting provider and with our content delivery network, and it includes an SLA with the various third-party vendors, such as Atlassian is where we're hosting JIRA. So, and that's actually going to be, we're going to have to revisit it when we start taking over some of these services. So, for instance, for anything that we log into, that it's more of a requirement now, but it was a requirement at least for our system back then. Everything had to be two-factor to get into. So whatever third-party platform we log into, it's two-factor authentication, and it's part of our CNA.
Okay,
so
it's grandfathered into your CNA. It's not, because anything moving forward now has to be FedRAMP.
Right.
Anything cloud service has to be FedRAMP. So I'm just wondering where you were at and how. So he's kind of grandfathered into your current CNA.
Right.
I didn't know where they were at.
Yeah, and
a solution that we could go use, because we don't have a CNA to go use that service.
Mm-hmm.
So, we hadn't been using it before last year this time, because last year this time everything, June 2014, any cloud service you use has to have FedRAMP authorization.
Right. So
Curious about that.
So yeah, as pointed out, FedRAMP is a requirement now for any CNA for any system. So actually, when we started the cloud hosting part of it, our hosting provider was not FedRAMP at the time, but became FedRAMP before our. So our SLA is with them, and I suppose that the other tools roll into that, but we actually have to reconsider that as we start taking over some of these third party tools. Questions? Suggestions? I was hoping to hear more suggestions out of it, but we really need
I
to.
think that we should do it, right?
Okay. We'll see. We'll report back next year, I guess. Okay. Well, that's it. I appreciate everyone's time. Thank you.